I recently got into arcade beat-em-ups by playing The Punisher, a Capcom game from 1993. After a bit of practice, I got a no-death clear of it on the hardest difficulty setting, and I think it's a great game for other players to play if they want to get into the beat-em-up genre. So compared to other arcade games like shoot-em-ups and fighting games, I feel like there are surprisingly few resources out there for learning how to play beat-em-ups at anything past the beginner level. To tell you the truth, despite having a decade of fighting game tournament experience and clearing several arcade games in other genres, I always bounced off beat-em-ups when I tried them in the past, so I'd like to talk about what I thought arcade beat-em-ups were, what they actually are, why I think The Punisher is a great game for beginners, and some tips on how to get started. When I first tried to get into arcade beat-em-ups, I'd sit back and I'd try to react to the enemy's attacks, just like I was playing Dark Souls or a character action game. Inevitably, I'd quickly get surrounded by enemies and chipped down by unreactable jabs. When I asked people how I was supposed to deal with this, they told me that beat-em-ups were unfair, outdated quarter munchers, and that I should just play them with infinite lives in co-op and treat them as a sandbox for doing cool combos on enemies. Personally, I always found making combo videos in actual fighting games to be a much more satisfying way to scratch my combo creativity itch. Thanks to their much larger movesets, their possibility spaces for combos being way bigger, and their well-balanced restrictions that you have to try and work around. So I was told that beat-em-ups weren't interesting to play as a skill-based game, and I didn't think they were very interesting to play as a combo sandbox game, so I just stuck to other arcade genres instead. Then years later, after giving them another try, with a better understanding of how they're meant to be played, I now know that everything I thought about them in the past was completely wrong. Beat-em-ups are really all about crowd control. Enemies in these games can attack you from the left or the right, because they're 2D sprites, so those are the only two directions they can face. And their attacks are usually instant, but your attacks usually outrange theirs, so you can punch them as they approach you. Just like the old arcade game, Spartan X. Because hitting an enemy in a beat-em-up enough times to knock them down takes much longer than just jabbing an enemy once in Spartan X, attacking the enemies on your left leaves you wide open to being attacked from the right, and vice versa. So enemies in this game try their best to spread out, surround you, and attack you from both sides at once, at which point you're practically guaranteed to get hit. And it's your job to stop this situation from occurring by pushing all the enemies together into a big heap and attacking them all at once. Fortunately, you can grab enemies and throw them around, which, in addition to making you briefly invincible, lets you grab an enemy that managed to sneak behind you and throw them back into the group. In short, the core of arcade beat-em-ups isn't doing a bunch of fighting game combos or winning a series of one-on-one duels or anything like that. They're about herding sheep. The enemies try and spread out, you try and group them back together, and that's it. Once I understood that, I quickly fell in love with the genre. There are lots of layers on top of that core, like attacks and weapons with different situational uses, enemies who can all move and attack in different ways, but all of these things just exist to spice up the challenge of grouping all the enemies up into a big ball and punching them all at once. Even most of the genre's best boss fights tend to work this way, with bosses who are trivially easy to defeat in a 1v1 fight, and who instead have to rely on other enemies to protect them and give the space they need to attack you. So why start with The Punisher? Well, I think it's a great choice for an arcade beat-em-up for several reasons. First off, its difficulty is very reasonable by arcade standards. I had no beat-em-up experience before this, aside from button mashing a few games and giving up, and it took me about 15 hours to get a 1 credit clear of the game on normal mode, then an additional 30 hours to get a no-death clear on hardest mode. So the whole thing took about 45 hours, which is less time than it took me to clear Dark Souls or a modern RPG. It's not that long. And clearing the game with no deaths is surprisingly forgiving by arcade standards. It's not too much harder than a 1 credit clear. It's a perfectly reasonable goal to go for. So if you do manage to get the 1 credit clear on the game on normal mode, it's not that much harder to get the no death clear, then a 1 credit clear on the hardest difficulty, then a no death clear on the hardest difficulty. It's a very smooth learning curve by arcade game standards. Another reason I recommend The Punisher for new players is that his moveset is ridiculously powerful. He's got huge fast jabs, a very long range dash attack, throws with a ton of invincibility, the option to pick up enemies off the ground and throw them, and an ultra fast dash roll that you can steer in every direction, even mid-roll. You can even pull out an auto-aimed gun with infinite ammo whenever any gun-wielding enemies are on the screen, making you practically invincible from the front, unless you're fighting against armoured enemies or a huge stack of enemies who you can't all shoot at once. So playing as such an overpowered character is a blast, and I'm not the sort of person who complains about older games feeling clunky in the first place, but even the most arcade-averse modern player should be fine with this game. And you'd think that your fast movement, your overpowered attacks would all kind of undermine the enemy's ability to surround and trap you, leaving you with a game where you can just run away from all your problems, pick off the enemies as they chase after you, and play this annoying hit and run playstyle. And there are a few places in the game where you can kinda get away with this playstyle to an extent, but somehow, especially during the last couple of stages, the game throws enough dangerous enemies at you from enough different angles that it forces you to engage and learn the fundamental beat-em-up gameplay. The game has a few downsides, like a few very short sections with walls where you can wedge yourself into a corner to stop enemies from getting behind you. You can then trivially punch them all down by mashing the jab button, and they're all forced to walk into your fists from the front, or from above or below, which still results in them getting hit, because you got a longer range than them in the Z-axis. But I don't think these games drag down the game too much, there's not that many of them. I'd argue that by far the worst part of the game is Stage 2's guard droid boss. He's permanently got super armor, so it doesn't go into hit stun when you hit it, so you gotta, dodge its attack, run up to it, hit it a couple times, back off while it attacks again, and repeat the process. It's nothing like the rest of the game, frankly nothing like a beat 'em up, and a lot worse than everything else. But if the absolute worst thing I can say about a game is that one of its bosses feels like a Dark Souls boss, I don't think that's that bad of a place for it to be. In summary, beat 'em ups are cool, The Punisher was a great place for me to start, and I'm looking forward to playing more of them. I've been playing Cadillacs and Dinosaurs this week, having a blast, and I'll try to get into Final Fight after that. If you're interested in trying to learn the game, here's a few tips for getting started. I'll start with a general tip for getting 1 credit clears of single-player arcade games. I've seen people find the very concept of a 1 credit clear daunting because they've only ever played the games with infinite continues, and just the prospect of clearing the entire game with only 1 or 2 deaths seems so far away. The trick is to break the game down into smaller goals. There's lots of ways you can do this, but I prefer to learn the game one section at a time. So first I'll learn to consistently clear the first half of stage 1 without dying, then the second half of stage 1, then the boss, then I'll put it all together, and so on. Most arcade game ports have practice modes that let you play any section this way, and most emulators have save states, so you can just save a state at the start of each section and essentially create your own practice mode. You can learn the whole game this way, then start going for full runs, and if everything goes well, you get the 1 credit clear. If you keep messing up at the same spot, you go back and practice that section for a bit, then go back to full runs. That said, this is only a suggestion. You can learn these games in whatever way is fun for you. I've seen a few people learn some very difficult games simply by credit feeding full runs over and over again while slowly trying to lower how many continues they need, until eventually they'll clear it without any continues at all. And beat 'em ups tend to be more about learning how to control your character and hurt enemies in general than they are about memorizing any specific section. So if that kind of learning method works for you, you'd rather just play a bunch of full runs, you can probably get away with it in this genre, it's not too bad. And here's some more specific tips for the Punisher. First off, your jabs are strong. They've got a very long horizontal reach, and just like the rest of your attacks, they outrange most enemies in the Z-axis too. And you mash the attack button for your auto combo, and the final hit of the combo is different depending on which direction you're holding. Holding no direction makes you kick the enemies for higher damage, holding forwards punches them across the screen, and lets you recover faster than the other combo enders. Holding up throws the enemy a long way behind you, and holding down throws them a shorter distance. You can even hold left or right during the startup of the down ender to choose which way you want to throw the enemies. Getting a ton of invincibility and being able to throw an enemy whichever way you choose is ridiculously strong, so you probably want to use the down ender most of the time, but the others are strong in some situations too. You can also grab an enemy by just walking into them. Because enemies can only attack left or right, it's usually safer to walk into them from above or below instead. If you really want to grab an enemy who's to your left or your right, your best option is probably to auto combo into the up or down ender instead of just trying to walk into them. There's also the option of grabbing enemies who are laying on the ground by walking up to them and pressing the attack button. Just to reiterate, throws are extremely strong. They turn you invincible and let you knock down a group of enemies for free. There are all sorts of evil enemies later in the game, but you can get really far just grabbing in a different enemy, turning invincible, and throwing their body as a projectile. This is the core of beat 'em ups. Pressing attack and jump at the same time does an invincible desperation attack that hits all nearby enemies on both sides. This does cost a little bit of health if it makes contact with the enemies, but it's much better than taking a hit. You can use it as a panic button if you're surrounded and you don't have enough time to auto combo into a grab with the invincibility. You can proactively use them to clear space, use them to hurt enemies together, deal huge damage to armored enemies or cornered bosses, or dodge projectiles, which doesn't even cost you any health if you don't touch an enemy. You can desperation attack while dashing, you can do it while grabbing an enemy, which gives you a ton of extra range, and you can do it in the air to spend a bomb instead of spending health. Bombs are great for clearing out huge crowds of enemies and dealing huge damage to bosses, and if you end a stage without any bombs, they'll even give you a few of them for the start of the next stage. Your dash is your main form of movement because it's super quick and it can be steered in any direction. Your dash attack reaches really far. It can be useful against enemies with long range knife attacks, but you don't get to combo them afterwards. You can dash into a regular attack or a throw too, as long as you let go of the direction to stop your dash right before you attack, otherwise you get the dash attack. Your jumps are quick too, and dashing into a jump makes it even faster, and doing a jump kick makes your jump quicker still. So dashing into a jump kick is very useful for running away horizontally or for chasing down an enemy who you just threw, so you can pick them up off the ground and throw them again. Pressing down up attack, so down then up an attack, gives you a heavy attack, which has slow startup but deals a ton of damage, especially if you're close enough for both the physical leg hit and the shockwave to connect. Well, slow startup can be a bit of a liability, but it does deal huge damage, and it's especially useful against the stage 2 guard droid boss. Your weapons are fairly similar to your heavy attack in the sense that they give you more damage at the cost of potentially having more startup. The weapons are pretty strong, and you can even throw them by attacking while you're in the air. The knife is an especially interesting weapon because you automatically throw it if you press the attack button while you're outside of melee range, but its melee hits deal a ton of damage. So if you can get right up to an enemy and mash out a whole ton of hits in melee range, you just tear through the health bar. And finally, you have a gun. You automatically pull it out whenever any enemies with guns or pretty boy robots are on the screen. It aims by itself, and you mash the attack button to shoot. It slightly outranges most enemies in the Z-axis, so a strong tactic in most gun sections is to run away to the top of the screen, mash the attack button to shoot enemies as they run up towards you, run down to the bottom of the screen, mash the attack button again as they run down towards you, and repeat. There are other strategies for specific enemies, bosses, and sections, but you're better off watching other people's runs to learn those things. These basic tips should be more than enough for you to load up the game, start punching enemies before they get close enough to punch you, then throw them all into a big pile, punch them all at once, and repeat. Good luck, and I hope you enjoy arcade beat-em-ups as much as I do.